to episode 80 of the Power Score LSAT podcast. I'm Dave Kaloran in sunny Napa Valley.
And this is John Dinning in, I presume, more sunny Los Angeles.
I don't know, John. It hit 80 degrees here yesterday. Can you top that?
Oh, we've got 66.
Sorry.
So
You just checked your phone for that, didn't you?
I did. Technically, I checked an Apple Watch, but yeah.
That's pretty good, though, at this hour.
I didn't know offhand. Yeah, late afternoon, doing a test recap. Here we are.
Yes, it is the February LSAT discussion, and a smaller test than we've had in the past, as we'll get to in just a few minutes. But it's been an interesting week on both the music front and on the drinking front. Let's start with drinks.
Let's start with drinks, per always. Well, you clued me in on the fact that it was National Margarita Day on February 22nd, this past Monday. Thank you for the heads up. So, I'm drinking a Casamigos Reposado on the rocks. As if you,
That's not really a margarita,
any listeners
though.
here clinking in the background, it's my cocktail.
That's not a margarita, though. That's just drinking straight tequila.
Call it Inspirado.
And
I was inspired to drink tequila.
Inspirado.
I did not drink a margarita.
Casamigos is George Clooney's brand, right?
It is, yeah. Well, it was. I think they sold it.
He sold it.
Him and Mr. Cindy Crawford. Which is how I prefer to think of Randy Gerber.
Randy Gerber.
Yeah.
Nice. And I think I always have to watch and make sure I don't get it confused with Ryan Reynolds' Aviation Gin brand or even Sammy Hagar's tequila that's out there as well.
Cabo Wabo or something like that.
Yeah. I have to keep my celebrity alcohols separated. I'm sure there's more than I'm missing.
There are lots more. I think Puffy owns Ciroc. We could do this all afternoon.
That is right. Well,
however, I'm not drinking a margarita. I am drinking tequila.
I'm drinking a margarita. It is late afternoon here. It's a nice day. It was beautiful out. So I'm just having a standard margarita on the rocks with salt, of course, because that's the way you actually have to drink it. Although I will say this, the tequila I'm using for this is fairly high end. And as I'm sure you'll explain, it's thanks to you. I'm using Clase Azul tequila, which is that hand-painted white tall bottle, which I'll be honest, I would never buy for myself. But you sent it to me. Why'd you send it to me?
I did. I sent it to you by way of apology. I screwed up a podcast. Some people will know this if they've been listening. I screwed up a podcast a couple of weeks ago where my audio didn't record correctly. And yeah, like I say, by way of apology, you spent an hour and a half talking to me for no audience, which is a shame.
They got my side of the...
Nobody.
My
I got
audio
your
recorded,
side.
so it was just one person.
So I thought to try to make it up to you in some small way, I would send you a good bottle of tequila. And I'm glad to see it's being put to good use. I hope your wife's getting some as well.
She's not a huge tequila fan. She likes margarita all right.
Well,
but
I did what I could.
That was a very, very generous gift. And as I told you beforehand, these things happen, and I didn't require any kind of tribute or gift.
No, you were incredibly gracious about it, which made me feel so much worse. So, thanks for nothing. But for anyone listeners out there who'd like to pick up a really good tequila, especially an apology tequila, I recommend Clase Azul. It's wonderful.
Yeah, this is supposed to be one of those sipping tequilas, but I'll be honest, there's no such thing to me.
I know. If you shouldn't be mad at me for screwing up that podcast, I'd be mad at you for mixing this with margarita mix.
Sorry. That's what it's meant for.
We'll call ourselves even
on this earth. So what's the music choice this week?
Yeah, well, there was a bit of bad news, I suppose, in the music industry, which is that Daft Punk has announced their, I guess you'd call it retirement, disbanding.
Yeah, both.
After a very long, productive, successful career, they have decided they are no longer going to make music. So what we decided to do is a little bit different, which is instead of recommending a song or two, we are going to really suggest the entire back catalog of Daft Punk. But I think we could probably put an emphasis on a few tunes.
I will put an entire emphasis on the Tron 2 soundtrack.
I knew you would. I know how much you love that soundtrack, and for good reason.
I love it. It's a great soundtrack to snowboard to. I particularly recommend Son of Flynn. That is my favorite song on there by a long shot, and that is that makes you feel like you're floating through the clouds. So, big fan of that. Love that band. Sorry to see them go.
Yeah, I'll say this, a bit of Dave trivia for anyone out there listening. Dave actually has a signed poster from the Tron 2 movie, signed by Garrett Hudland, Olivia Wilde, Jeff Bridges, which again shows his appreciation.
They thanked me for my fandom.
I'm sure they're appreciative. Yeah. Yeah.
No, they didn't actually. I just bought it.
They had a couple other songs though that are maybe timely for the topic today. One is "Get Lucky," of course, with I think Pharrell Williams, and then "Harder, Best, Better, Faster, Stronger." But another breakup soundtrack, as it turns out, with Kanye West at the moment.
Kanye's going through some troubles there with old Kim.
Ain't it a shame that we know that?
You know what's amazing, though, is that she stayed with him for that long.
Kim's a trooper.
She stuck it out.
Good.
Of course, when two celebrities who seem to be very interested in fame get together and then break up, I'm going to be entirely honest to all listeners. I don't really care. Tough luck for them.
Yeah. Well, the good news is you and I are still going strong. And I think that's all anyone here cares about.
Is this our celebrity podcast marriage?
Yeah, I think we're renewing our vows at the moment.
Fantastic.
Love
As we
you,
approach
buddy.
episode 100, we can talk about
Yeah,
that.
seriously. 80 episodes and going strong. Let's talk about the LSAT world. What's up?
Thank you.
Yeah,
Let's move on to something that's actually... Yeah, as soon as Kim Kardashian comes up as part of the topics, I want to talk about something else. The LSAT world is clearly going to be all about the February LSAT recap. So we've got that. The one thing I will say is, as always, once an LSAT has passed, go take your LSAT writing if you haven't done so. As of the other day, there were 6,000 people from the February test, which is almost half, not quite, but almost half of the test takers still needed to have an LSAT writing on record, but didn't have one. If you take it this week, and we're recording this on Wednesday, kind of like late afternoon or early evening, then you can go ahead and you'll still be able to get your score on time. But the later you go, the more likely it is that your score will be pushed back too far, or they won't be able to release your score on time. So go out and take that LSAT writing. And remember, when you go in, to try to avoid some of the problems that you might run into in terms of causing a violation. You want to cover those, John?
Yeah, I was going to say, let's just run through them again for the unaware. Some of the key things for making sure that you don't get flagged by the AI system that proctors you during your writing. Show both sides of your scratch paper. Don't wear any kind of smartwatch. That goes for an Apple Watch all the way down to a Fitbit or something that could be construed as potentially helpful. Make sure the photo that you show of yourself and your ID is clear. That's pretty well automated at this point. And don't have anything in view of the camera, like a cell phone or a backpack, whether on your desk or in the backdrop of the room that you're writing in. I think that mostly covers it.
Yeah, I would say so.
Yeah.
You know, typically what happens if you get flagged, they just check you and make sure that nothing untoward happened, and then they pass you through. But things like the smartwatch are the type of things where that's the end of the line. Then you have to redo it. So it's just make sure you just run through that beforehand, go out and take it. If you are uncertain about what to write, we've got a couple of resources that you can actually go back and access. We did a podcast, episode 15, on the digital writing section, as well as a blog called The Ultimate Guide to the LSAT Writing. And so if you want to just make sure you're going to do it the right way and understand exactly what's going to happen, go access one of those two, and then you'll be golden. Won't be a problem for you.
Yeah, it's really easy to do this correctly. Just don't screw it up. This is the last thing you need to worry about.
It's like a circular argument. It's really easy to do. Don't screw it up.
Yes.
So what do we have with the February LSAT, John? This was this past weekend for us.
Yeah, it's. I can't tell if it feels like last night or last year.
Feels like a month ago to me already.
Seriously. You mentioned the writing. Part of the reason that we're emphasizing doing the writing and essentially getting all this taken care of is that the score release date is March 10th. And we want you to get your score on the release date the morning of, as you will if you have done all the things that are required of you. So March 10th is when we'll know the results of the February test. You kind of alluded to the fact, Dave, that about 6,000 people hadn't completed the writing yet, and that wasn't quite half of the people who'd taken the test. Let's get into those numbers.
Yeah, the two main test days that we have were Saturday and Sunday. So this was smaller than past tests. And as it turned out, they had an expected number on Saturday of about 7,000.
Mm-hmm.
They ultimately had 6,600 people sit down and take the exam. Then on Sunday, they expected around 6,500. They got 6,300. So that was 12,900 test takers right there, approximately. And then earlier today, the paper and pencil testers have started, and there's just a couple 100 of those.
Yeah.
So right around 13,000 in terms of the overall number of test takers, probably a little bit over that. There are retakers. I don't know how many of them there are, although this administration went pretty smoothly, so it's my understanding the numbers are down. They won't take the test until next week. It'll be a different test typically that they are given. So none of the things that we're going to talk about today will really apply to them. Sorry about that for their sake.
Yeah, me too. I've been asked that question a bunch. Even today, I've been asked that question. I'm retaking next week. Are you guys going to release a podcast that'll help?
No.
Sorry.
We're not going to give, a couple dozen people a big advantage on the exam. That's just not how it works. We want it to be fair. We've said this many times before. I'm not interested in talking to cheaters. I'm not interested in hearing about cheating. I'm not interested in giving people advantages that are unfairly given. I'm interested in helping people who want to work hard and study and actually get better at the test. But I'm not going to. Sometimes we get people who write us privately, hey, tell me about this passage. Where is it from? What was the topic? And I'm like, we're not having this conversation, but thanks.
Yeah, those get shut down immediately. We'll talk in a second about maybe what is and isn't allowed as we go through this. Before we do, you referenced the idea that this was a pretty smooth administration. I agree with you. This one seemed to go really well.
I think because the size made things easier, but it is also my understanding that on a per capita basis, the number of problems was lower than on past administrations. And we said this last time because January was a pretty good test too, that what we expected to see going forward was that as they had more iterations of testing, that they would get better and better at it.
Yeah, you'd like to think that with experience comes proficiency.
I do think that there is a built-in error rate because there's always going to be problems, sometimes with the proctors and human error. Sometimes it's a technical issue, as we will talk about in a second with like some versions of Mac.
Yeah.
And then sometimes it's just like your internet goes in or out, and that had nothing to do with you. So there's always going to be some problems that occur. I don't think that it'll ever get to a point. And I will say, as we always say when we do this, if you're one of the people who had a problem, then the test is catastrophic for you.
Yeah.
We understand that. We're not making light of it. We're just saying that the overall rate of problems has been dropping since the inception of this. They seem to be learning. It's kind of like that AI machine where it's like it's getting smarter with every cycle of computing.
Yeah, poor Kasparov. He never stood a chance. But yeah, I mean that's really what this is. It's learning as we go, and they're getting better, and that's precisely what you would want. You'd want a system in place where they do improve with time.
Although there's a really interesting story because I'm not sure everybody picked up on that Kasparov reference, but that's Garry Kasparov, the grandmaster of chess, and I'm sure you're referencing when he was playing Deep Blue.
Deep Blue, of course.
Yeah, the IBM computer. There's a really interesting story that kind of came out of that. So he was in one game, and Deep Blue made a move that he couldn't understand, and so he kept playing on for a little bit, but it kept bothering him. And he kept thinking, why did the computer do this? And it really got inside his head. And so he resigned the game. And basically, they drew the game at that point. He offered the draw. And Deep Blue took it. And he had an advantage. And so he was really kind of like confused by what had happened. Well, the programmers went back in and they went through the code and they found there was a mistake. They discovered that shouldn't have happened, and really that was almost like a randomized move. But in chess, that move threw him off so badly that even though he had an advantage, he was like, I missed something.
Interesting. It triggered some like innate suspicion that he could never get over.
Yeah, he expected perfection from the computer.
Right.
And so when it did something completely unpredictable to him, a guy who'd seen, so many of the variations that were likely there, it just obliterated his ability to concentrate and to have confidence that he could win.
If I'm going to stretch this into some sort of LSAT analogy, it's a little bit like when they throw a really easy question in the late teens.
Nice.
It's like, wait a minute, this can't be so simple.
I'll be honest, it's really like if they throw an easy question in anywhere.
Yeah,
How many
fair.
times have people said, I was doing this question and it was just way too easy? I'm like, there are easy questions on the LSAT.
Sure.
Not a lot of them, but they do exist. So that was a total sidebar. But when you mentioned Kasparov, I was like, I've got to get
you and I have, let's call it, threatened over the years to eventually spin this podcast into some sort of like after hours episode. This is exactly what it would look like.
That's what that conversation would be for sure.
Yeah.
So we know it was overall a very smooth administration with the February LSAT. I guess the question is what problems did we see? And do we know anything about the causes of those?
To a degree. I mean, there does seem to still be some sort of incompatibility issue with Macs. At least Macs running a certain software. And maybe you can speak more authoritatively on this. I won't pretend to have full command of what this issue is. But I will say on Big Sur 11.1, whatever it is, the latest OS, and Log Me and Rescue, which is the program that ProctorU requires you to download, there seems to be some occasional Mac issue.
Yeah, I saw that too. And I wish that I could, illuminate everybody on exactly what the problem is with the Mac and Big Sur. But I can't because I'm not a Mac user.
And I actually am and still don't have the answer. So shame on us both, but more on me. If you think you're getting another bottle of tequila out of that, you're wrong.
No, I don't expect that. One was more than I expected. I was like, look at. By the way, John, the size of the box.
Yeah.
The size of the box that they sent that thing in was massive. I was actually irritated by the size of it. And then I looked at it. Yeah, and I looked at it and I was like, why have they used such a large box? And of course, it was padded out like crazy. I was like, oh, this is like an expensive tequila.
Can I repeat the quote from your wife that you texted me?
Yeah.
Would that be inappropriate?
No, go right ahead.
Dave receives the tequila offering and texts me. He says, Amanda says you've got a huge package. And it is only her sense of humor that has kept you two together. I'm convinced of this.
No, there's lots more than that. But her sense of humor is excellent, and she had a big laugh about that because she too was mystified by the size of the box. It's like, why is it so gigantic?
It's a little much. Yeah. Anyway, it contains greatness, but it's overdone.
We'll be the judge of that.
As for the Mac, what we have recommended people to do in past issues with ProctorU is just to try to get there in early and certify or confirm that their system, their OS, their configuration is going to work. And there are ways that you can do this with ProctorU in advance. Take advantage.
Yeah, and let's realize that if you do have some catastrophic issues, typically, if it is really bad, there is a retake that happens about a week and a half later. In this case, the retake is on Thursday, March 4th. Mm-hmm. And the people who have that retake have now basically been set in process with that. But I will remind everybody that, they do this all the time. They give themselves enough time now so that they don't have problems or any kind of, hassle in terms of like the time needed to get someone into the retake. But you won't get it for just any problem. If you go out for 5 seconds, you're not going to get the retake. I don't even think a minute or two is enough at this point to get the retake. That's a totally different question and totally different debate. But usually it's people who have gone in and out of the test like 4 or 5 times, or they just got stopped in the middle and could never come back. So don't go into the test thinking, well, if I have a little bit of a problem, the retake's an option. It probably isn't if it's a little problem.
Yeah, I always tell people that the retake is basically a safety net that you hope to never use. It's not the sort of thing you count on. Don't go in planning to fall.
And I'll also make another comment about making the complaint itself, and that is this. Use the form in your LSAC account. That is the fastest way, I've been told repeatedly, for them to get the information, and they have people watching that kind of like incoming account all the time. We've said before that the people on the phones at LSAC sometimes show variable knowledge. Sometimes they're incredibly knowledgeable, and sometimes they're not really certain of what they're doing. But this is a way for you to bypass that and to get as quick a response as possible. It also means that if you don't get an answer instantly, you still have like a week, week and a half before your test retake would possibly come up. So you can take a moment to kind of like catch your breath then.
Yeah, people testing over this past weekend who ran into issues have got 11, 12 days before they're going to retest. I think that's great. I mean, I know it's a little frustrating, but at least it gives LSAC time to make the right decisions and to thoroughly investigate the situations that deserve it.
Yeah, well, they used to have people taking the test on Thursday, and they were using Friday as the retake day.
Yeah.
And they had less than 24 hours to turn it around. And they were like, this is insane. So a couple tests ago, they started pushing it back to the following week. And I think that's made a big difference on everybody's kind of like stress level.
Yeah, it seems to have helped. While we're doing PSAs, can we do one more about the degree to which information can or should not be shared?
Do the whole PSA on that.
Me do the whole PSA. All right.
You want me to?
No. I assumed we would trade off. The first thing I will say is this, and I see this still constantly as a misconception, which is that just because you have the same section order as someone else does not mean that you have the same test. As a bit of background here, or context, LSAC has, since the beginning of the Flex, used multiple configurations of test content over the span of a test weekend or test week. So just because you took the May 2020 or the February 2021 test doesn't mean you have the same content as someone else. And then describing that in terms of your section order doesn't mean you have the same content either. If you had reading comp first, you may have had 4 different passages. So that's one thing that I want to caution people against presuming. You don't necessarily get the same test form just because you had the same test order of sections.
Let's talk about that because I actually watched 2 people online, kind of trading some comments in a very generalized way, which we'll talk about reading comprehension. And they did not realize that they were talking about different tests that they had. They had different reading comprehension sections, but they were convinced it was the same because it had appeared in the same spot on their exam.
Because they had it first or last or whatever.
Yeah, and we largely stay out of these conversations online because we think that's probably the fairest thing to do overall. But as I watched it, I was like, there's some tricky stuff going on with LSAC with the test presentation, which I'll talk about shortly. But just because you have the same order, you can't assume, oh, I had the same test. I saw a lot of people saying that, and I was like, there's no guarantee here. So keep that in mind. The other thing I will point out is that after the test, what you talk about and the way you talk about it is changing over time. It used to be that back in the olden days, and I'll use the olden days as about 3 years ago, maybe 2, before all this Flex stuff, everybody took the test on the same day. And as the East Coast was kind of like finishing up, the West Coast people were already in the rooms taking theirs. There was very little overlap of people being out and about and able to talk about it and still have other test takers who had yet to go in. And so there was a lot of sharing online about topics, about difficulty, and so forth. And what we really found back then was you could get a really good sense of what had happened with the test. The Flex changes that because it's no longer one administered test like it was back then. Now there's, we see situations where sometimes there's 8 versions, sometimes there's 24, sometimes it's 36, sometimes it's 45 or 54 different versions. And of course, the bigger the test administration, the greater the number of versions that you're actually going to run into.
Right.
But LSAC has said this to me, and they say to all test takers, we really don't want you to talk about the test that much. However, they also recognize that people are humans and they want to be like, man, that passage on aesthetics was rough, or whatever the case may be. Like,
Right.
This was my test and I thought the test overall was difficult. And so they always have the same rules here. Don't be too specific. As we know, there was a circular game on this exam, and I saw a ton of people come out of the exam and be like, oh, that table game. I'm like, you're telling everyone else what the game type is. It'd be the same thing if I was like, the first game is grouping.
Mm-hmm.
You don't want to do that. You don't want to talk about answer choices. what they have made clear over the years is you can talk about topics.
Right.
So you can say, all right, I had a game about, diplomats or a diplomatic delegation. That's fine. But don't say, yeah, it was 8 diplomats sitting around a table, or delegates, whatever it was, as
Right.
it turns out. And so it's the generalities are okay. Section order is fine. The basic topics that you saw in logical reasoning. But beyond that, they really do not want to see that. And the other thing is this: if you're out there asking for, like, hey, DM me, they are watching these boards. I guarantee you that they are watching. If you try to push this too far, you're going to hear from them, and it probably won't be a pleasant encounter, nor should it be.
Yeah, that's never a message you want to receive. But again, I think you draw a pretty clear line there. You can talk about topics. Don't say anything that would give other people a way to change their approach to the test.
Yeah, what I've seen with them on difficulty has changed too. It used to be they didn't seem to care about discussing difficulty, but because the test now goes over multiple days, it seems like it's okay to talk about section difficulty. Wow, I had this section, it was hard, because you don't know where the difficulty is.
Right.
But they don't want you talking about this game was hard.
Yeah, games 2 and 4 were really brutal, but 1 and 3 were easy. I'm glad I did those 2 first.
Yeah, then somebody gets an advantage. So
Right.
generalities, that's what you can disclose. And, this is all built around the idea that people are going to talk, and they would rather have them talk in the light, in these forums, in public, so they can see what's being said, versus going on to some Discord or having a direct messaging exchange where they don't know about the level. It's kind of just like humans are humans. They're going to want to chat about a big event that just happened. And so we understand that. We're willing to give a little bit on this, but don't push it. And I don't think that's unreasonable personally.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think their position on this is actually pretty fair. So, there you go. Don't be afraid to talk topics. Do be extremely hesitant in talking strategy.
So let's get into the February LSAT.
Let's talk topics.
Now, let's once make our own disclaimer.
Yeah, I know.
You often make this disclaimer, John, but I'll make it this time. And that is this: nothing that we're talking about is secret. It is public knowledge. We do rely upon information that we have from prior administrations of these sections, because guess what? They certainly have been administrated previously. But nothing that we're going to disclose is going to be specific. We're not going to give you answer choices. I'm not going to tell you exactly how to set up certain games or what you should have been looking at in a particular paragraph of reading comprehension. We're going to give you a sense of what the test was, our perceptions of the difficulty based not only on what students said, but what we know of the test from past uses. And then we're going to talk a little bit about the scaling and the possible outcomes that we get with each one of these.
That's right.
So, Saturday morning,
Flashback
John.
to Saturday morning. Here we go.
It dawned. A bright and sunny day.
Yeah, I think I'm correct in saying that I woke up to a text from you.
Yeah.
You, as per usual, beat me a little bit to the punch here. And the text was, they're using February 2014.
Yes, and they were.
And you were correct. Yeah.
Which I knew within minutes.
It'd have been a weird introduction if I was like, Dave texted me and was wrong.
He was wrong. No, I was right here. And
You were.
I'm not, that sounds like a brag now that I say it that way, but it's not. It was just like, man, it was actually surprised that when I sent that to you, I was like, they're using this test again? Because they have used
I read it twice.
this in multiple times before. They used it in 2018, very notably, and a number of other instances as well. And this test is a fair test. They used all sections of it. They used both the LRs and the reading comp and the logic games. So when I saw that early on Saturday morning, I immediately texted you because I was like, wow, I can't believe they're actually doing this again. It's been relatively soon. And this ended up being really, I'd say, the backbone of the administration. They did rotate in some other sections, as we'll talk about, but they used all 4 sections from the February 2014 LSAT, which had never been disclosed before. I will say this: as we go through this discussion, if you don't hear your section talked about, it may be because they did give you a variant that not many people got. And that is, perhaps if you took the LSAT previously and you had seen this test, they won't give it to you again. They do track that. So it is entirely possible that there are a few people out there who had a completely different test that we're not going to cover today. There's sometimes a few people who fall into that group because they don't want to give them the same test twice.
Yeah,
For
as you
obvious
just mentioned,
reasons.
this February 2014 test has been used rather widely as administrations. The biggest one was the July 2018 North American test. So if you happen to take that test in particular, it's entirely possible that coming back to this February, they gave you something different.
That's exactly right. So let's go through what happened.
Mm-hmm.
This is a logic game section that is very interesting, and I felt like students this time around didn't seem to be as affected by this section. But this is a section that has art installations. It has a garden and the department store floors, and they're
Right.
selling like furniture, gardening stuff, housewares, and so forth. Schools and plays is another game in there. And then you have diplomats and a delegation sitting clockwise at a circular table. And so that last game is kind of like a double stacked circular game. And this was something that we had predicted they would reuse several years back. We'd actually had a really strong feeling that this test was coming up soon, and we'd have told our students, why don't you study circular games? And then they went and used it. So I was surprised to see it come back. But this was a section that has historically been perceived as relatively hard, mostly because the last game is just a little bit different than what most people have seen. But I think in the last few years, people have spent a lot more time studying circular games. Although some people haven't, as I saw a few people like, oh, that game, I didn't know how to do it. I only looked at like one or two of those my whole time studying. I'm like, always look at outliers.
We'll talk about what this means for the scale here in a bit. You and I,
I think you and I have a slight disagreement about what this means.
Yeah,
In the
you
past,
took
we
the words
wouldn't,
out of
but
my
this
mouth.
time we do.
Yeah, but I can tell you the response that I saw from people in February 2014 and then again in July 2018 was far stronger than what I saw over the past weekend.
It's very mild,
It did
given
seem
what we know
pretty,
historically about this
yeah,
section.
yeah. The rancor that this tends to cause didn't seem to quite be there. It didn't explode the way that it has in past instances.
So then they go into reading comprehension, and they use the February 2014 reading comp. So I was like, this is excellent. And this is the passage section that starts off with the French Revolution and women's rights, which is kind of an interesting topic, as we'll see, because I'm going to highlight a theme here in a few minutes. Then there's another passage about the common law, international law, specifically in regard to indigenous rights in Belize.
Yeah.
So the Belize thing is a real trip because you can see automatically if anybody starts talking about reading comp with Belize that they were having this section. And it's funny because, John, you and I happen to know that although this was used officially in February of 2014, that passage, for example, was pre-tested
It predates
on
it.
on an experimental in June 2011. And so we're able to see as we go back, like, okay, here's where they used it as a complete test, and here's where they were testing it in the years before.
Can I just interject one quick point, which actually echoes something you and I have both talked about, but you in particular have been a pretty advocate of, which is the idea of if all you think about these current tests are that you need to study the most recent things, it's a bit misleading. This is a passage from not only February 2014 in full use, but the dates of back to 2011. It's almost 10 years old.
I'll finish the next two passages and maybe we'll talk about that point because it's something I really do want to get to because I'm seeing such an avid focus on what test should I take. I had people asking me on Saturday night, what exam do I take before my test tomorrow? And I won't answer that question just so anybody who's like making a future note, like ask Dave, because I don't think it's fair. And I tell people that kindly. I'm like, I really can't tell you anything like that. But the last two passages on that section, there's one about art and sports commentators talking about the aesthetics. And I'll just point out, be careful. There's another passage in the other section about aesthetics. It's made it rather challenging, I think, for people to realize they were looking at different passages. And this was a comparative passage that some people said was a little bit tricky. And then I think the last passage in that section is about chaotic systems in physics. And I think it's linear, nonlinear.
Yeah,
Might even have to do with Karl Popper. I'm doing that by memory, so I'm not 100%. And that's a hard passage right there. But those are the four passages, and I'll point something out about this. So there's a passage about the French Revolution and women's rights. This is going to be mirrored later in the other section. There's one about aesthetics. This is also mirrored in the other section. And then you have this sciencey passage that's got a little bit of like, I'm not going to say space elements, but it's like physics systems. And the other passage has got one that's a little bit more like astronomy and what have you. But this made it really hard for people to realize which reading comp they were on, because they'd be like, "Oh, I had the aesthetics passage," and I was like, in my mind, I'm kind of yelling, "There's two of them.
Which one? Right.
Yeah, which one did you have?" And then I would watch somebody respond like, "Oh yeah," and I'm like, "I don't think so." So this is not an easy reading comprehension section, and a lot of times you hear people say, "Oh, the reading comp in the 80s," meaning the prep tests from 80 to 89 specifically, not the 1980s, that the reading comp in the 80s is really tough. I agree with that. I think the passages in the prep tests from the 80s are very difficult, but this isn't technically a reading comprehension section from the 80s. Studying the 80s prepares you well for it, but as you can see, some of the passages stretch back here to well before 2014. And this is why it's kind of, I think the point you're making is you got to be really careful about thinking, oh, I can just study the 80s and I'll be good.
Right. Yeah, I think a proper preparation here almost demands that you have a longer historical view on this. If
They
you
do.
think that if you think you're sufficiently covered through the last 4 years, you may be actually shooting yourself a bit short, because clearly they're pulling tests out from far beyond that.
My view of it, in case anybody is kind of like setting up a study plan, is that the reading comprehension and the logical reasoning from the prep tests in the 80s prepares you for anything.
Yeah.
It's challenging, it's tricky, it's got some density to it. You study those tests, and on the verbal side of this test, you're going to be in really good shape. If you want to study the logic game side, the analytical reasoning side, it's not actually the 80s to me that is the most relevant. It's probably the tests that are in like the first 20 to 30 exams.
Interesting.
Not all of them, but many of the weirdest things that you see on this test are fairly old. And so when someone's like, well, what should I study? I'm like, well, where's your weakness?
Yeah.
Oh, it's logic games. I'm like, go back far. Because you can go back and see some games in the early days where you're like, this is strange. And it's like, yep, you want to do this type of game.
I think I'm going to have to insist on a little bit of clarification from you.
Uh-oh.
Because I could hear someone out there, imagine someone out there listening to you say that and thinking you mean it in exclusivity. And I don't think you do. I think you mean that you need to couple the most recent stuff with really ancient tests from the 90s, the 1990s.
Yeah,
you're not saying that the tests from the first 20 are more relevant.
No, I'm saying they're all relevant, but don't skip those. Perfect. Just like when you're doing reading comp, make sure you've done the most recent tests. Like they need to be included, but they are not the sole and only test that you should do.
Okay, good.
How's that?
Yeah, no, that's perfect. I agree with you on that. Sorry for being nitpicky.
No, that's actually a good thing to do because, we don't want any misunderstanding. It's also one of the reasons that I really like how our analytics program works is because you can go actually look at just the logic game section from, say, test 1 through 20 or 1 through 40 or whatever you want to do. You can look at everything individually. So if you're like, look, I don't have time to do all 90 tests or so, well, I'll make sure that I do the most recent 10, and then I can cherry pick some interesting sections from the early days.
Yeah.
You want to have that type of access to studying here.
The feedback in that is so wonderfully informative too that it could tell you like you need to focus on this type of game and then give you specific references as to where to go to find more. And that might be PT 8 or 12 or something.
From the old days, the early 1990s, the 90s as it really was.
That's right.
And it's funny, John, because I think next week you and I are involved in another analytics meeting where we're going to go through, I think, the second or third version of upgrading the analytics and making some additions to some of the stuff that we do with that.
It's actually one of the more exciting things that we do, at least for me. I think you agree. It's so much fun to see the data that we can get into with this stuff.
Yeah, there's so many users in that system now, thousands of people using the analytics that we can now pull in information such as like what does the average person choose? What does somebody who's scoring 170 and above choose? We can start to break it down into these really kind of like cool analytics points and allow you to compare yourself to different groups and say, where am I doing this right? Where am I going wrong? And to kind of like get better as fast as possible.
Yeah. Yeah, it's useful.
Let's continue on with
Let's
this
talk about LR.
particular
What
test.
else was on that February 14 test?
Ah, yes. Both the LRs were very interesting. They used both the logical reasoning sections from February 2014, one of which had 26 questions, which was harder than the 25 question LR. And I will say this, once again, when I say harder, that doesn't mean the other section was easy. What it means that it was relatively easier. I have said this before. I'll say it every single time we do this. I strongly believe that every LSAT section is hard. So we're already in the difficult arena. But there is differences at the difficulty level when you're at the highest levels of difficulty. So if I say this section was easier, this passage was easier, I'm not saying it was easy. I'm saying it just wasn't as hard as some of the other ones.
Yeah, these things are always relative. Let's talk about the 26, which I agree was the harder of the two.
Yeah, and I believe the 26 one is the one that has questions about teddy bears. A very tough question about babies and parents buying them teddy bears and so forth. There's a question about exoskeletons in there, pesticide use in various countries, rival toy companies, and then not relying on artificial lab experiments using human subjects. And some people felt that section wasn't as bad. A lot of them felt that that was hard. And I'd say, as we'll see, that this probably was, to me, the harder of the two. The other section is the one that has manoraptors in it. It's got plants releasing CO2. It's got crabs, and I think bioluminescence and maybe ultraviolet as well. It's got something about like New France and Quebec and cards and China and coins and some kind of gigantic question, apparently.
Yeah.
And then neighbors reporting each other over rules violations. And again, that's just a selection of topics. Although we know some of the question types that are in there, we're not going to talk about that. And to be honest, at this point, it's not going to help anybody anyway.
Yeah, it won't matter. I saw both of those being reported on Saturday, which obviously led to some confusion, but that was the full February 2014 LSAT being used that day.
I think you and I had a hope, I'll call it, a belief. Certainly a hope.
Definitely
for
a hope.
Our personal well-being.
I know what you're going to say. Definitely a hope.
That what they were going to do was just use this test, and that was it. That they were going to use two versions of it. They knew the test was only for 2 days. Let's do it. And so when I woke up on Sunday, I was still kind of under that belief, although I don't think that's what happened, because I believe later on Saturday they started using other reading comp. It was a little confusing, and other logic games, which had some confusing elements to it as well. And I think, John, we should be honest about what was happening. On Saturday afternoon, you and I were both, I don't know, dying was maybe the best word.
Normally I would say that's too strong a word, but it certainly felt terminal. Yeah, I was struggle city come Saturday afternoon, and then Sunday it felt torturous, man, just Sisyphus.
Yeah. I think we'd gotten to the point where we're like, after about 5 or 6 hours on Saturday morning, our thinking was, they're going to do it. They're just going to use Feb 2014 and we're done. And the elation of that. And then as the day wore on, I was like, I'm starting to see some other stuff here that doesn't look quite like what I expect to see. And I was reading some reports, and I was like, I think I sent you a message. It was like, I think they've slipped in new sections.
Yeah, we both kind of covered our ears to the truth as long as we could. But it was inevitable. There was another RC and there was another games.
Yeah, so let's talk about the other RC, which is not a section that we have a whole lot of prior knowledge about. So this is probably something that was, used out as an experimental on international tests and Sabbath day tests from long ago. And sometimes the records are hit or miss, our records at least, on those tests, because there's not as many people who took them. And so there wasn't as much feedback. But as you'll see here, you could see how people could get the two RCs confused. This one had women's suffrage. All right, so again, kind of women's rights, women's suffrage, but this time it was in relation to African American women. But you would see people talking about, I had the women's rights passage.
Yeah.
Well, the question really was that about the suffrage and African American women, or was it about the French Revolution? Because if you just talked about women's rights, you didn't know which one you were actually looking at. And again, I could see people having confusion over this. The next passage, or one of the 4 passages, was about aesthetic knowledge and judgments. I saw this one called aesthetic testimony.
Yeah, I saw that too.
This passage was clearly quite difficult. And so, but notice, again, aesthetic. Well, the other one was like a sports versus art aesthetics. So here, if somebody was talking about just a passage on aesthetics, everybody who took this test thought that was my section.
Yeah.
But it wasn't. There was another one on copyrights, and then another passage on ancient astronomy. And so another kind of science passage. And so here you could see, and I'll be honest, I think this is fully and culpably intentional,
Of course,
by the people who make this test. They knew that it was a small testing group. Let's go ahead and, make it confusing. Let's make it hard for people to know what it was they actually had, because muddying the waters totally serves LSAC's benefit here.
Yeah, and
So,
for a couple of saps like us who are hoping they just use the same test, and we start to hear aesthetics and women's, rights, and it's science and astronomy. We're like, it's the same. But of course, digging even a little bit deeper revealed that it wasn't. But yeah, you're right, dude. This has to be it's purposeful. What, obscurantism?
yeah, and we know that certain topics come up. Like if somebody says, yeah, there was a business question in both LRs, they were trying to trick me. Okay, no, because business is a really common
Right.
topic, and dinosaurs being another common topic.
Sure.
But we've seen this before where certain people who write this test will talk about concepts over and over again. Serotonin, for example, waggle dances.
Waggle dances and bees. That's always the one.
I know that was coming to your mind next. Somebody who has a really deep knowledge about a particular topic, well, why not write 2 or 3, passages about it? So in this case, this was another hard RC, in my opinion.
Yeah.
We're seeing this consistently, and I think what's happening is that LSAC has identified that RC, if they just make it consistently hard, it'll do more separation than if they make either of the other 2 sections difficult. So I think that's probably here to stay for a while. And then the last section that we saw was a different logic game section. And this was the game section that had like the senior employees training like the new junior ones. There was a game about servers at intermission, kind of like waiters serving things at multiple intermissions. That was not easy. That was an experimental, by the way, from I think back in September of 2019. That game is we found that.
I believe you're right.
I believe
it may
there was
even
also
predate it back to June 2017.
I think you're right about that, didn't we?
I think that's right. Yeah, there's a couple of prior instances of a game sounds a lot like it.
Yeah, I think that June 2017 is actually the senior junior game that goes back there.
Maybe that's what it was. I knew that there was a summer 2017 moment that had reappeared.
And you can see what's happening is, well, they tested it here, they tested it there, now they've combined it all together after they have enough data on it. Yeah. This is how they do it. It also allows us to see those patterns and helps us figure out what is actually being used, but it's a tangled web. It looks like just a massive number of strings that are just kind of crisscrossing all over the place. There was another game about I think it was a political candidate making stops. It was almost like a bus stop, bus route. Yeah. And then the last one, this is tougher for us to figure out. I've seen this game called a couple different things. Some people called it a graphic designer art portfolio. I had other people describe it as illustrations for a theater magazine that had like wardrobe and props and lighting. I'm not entirely locked in on that yet, and that sometimes it takes us a little bit longer than we have in the couple of days interim here to be able to say with certainty. But that was the other section, and you can see where they use some of the elements here from 2019, 2017, what have you. I don't think this was the worst game section overall, and so that will figure into the matrix that we kind of put into place. But that intermissions and server game was the one that I think was the hardest out of all of those.
Yeah, that was the vibe I got from it too, but still a slightly more manageable section than the other.
That's right. Which takes us...
Let's get into it.
That's it. Yeah, normally we've got like 3, 3, and 3 or 3, 3, and 4 to go. But what you have here is 8 total versions of the test. You've got 2 logic games, 2 reading comprehension, 2 logical reasoning, and since we use just one section of each, there are 8 different forms. And again, as I said before, you may have some outlier forms that were used for people who had other issues.
I was just about to reiterate that, so thank you.
Yeah, I think this covers like 95 to 98% of all test takers. But we're being upfront about the fact that there are some people who had tests that, as far as I can tell, they were one of the very, very few people who had it. So we're not going to cover it here. So we got 8 outcomes. And as usual, we start with our matrix at -7. And before we go any further, John, I'll first say this. We start at -7, and that means the following: that you could miss 7 questions on your test version and still get a 170. All right, when we talk about the so-called scaling, the curve, that minus number, whether it's 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, it relates to the number of questions missed to get a 170. Now, when we do this, we tend to be a little conservative.
You're about to ask me, right?
Yeah. Why are we conservative, John?
Well, I mean, if we are going to err, and I'd like to think we never do, but if we are going to ever make a mistake in one direction or the other, it's always, I think, better for us to err on the side of conservatism. Better for us to be a little tight on the scale than to be too loose. I would much rather not give people false hope if I can help it.
I'd rather surprise them with an extra point on the scale than disappoint them with a score 1 lower than what they were thinking.
We thought you were -8. Turns out you're -7. That's a far worse miss than us saying -7, and it turns out it's -8, which feels like Christmas. That said, you and I may split a little bit. Here I am preaching conservatism. I may be the slightly more liberal of the two of us.
I think you will be, and I will disagree with you. You will get much love for that, and I will get much criticism. However,
that's the only reason I did it.
I don't do this for popularity. I do this for accuracy. So I have to go with how I feel.
I only do it for popularity.
You're Mr. Popularity.
Yeah, that's right.
You do seem to be popular, John.
Thanks. I have my moments.
If we could get out into the actual world again and go have some fun, we get back to the days.
I was talking to a student the other day, and she goes, "I just can't wait to hug people again." And I was like, I feel you on that. Like, I just want to do a hug tour, a Power Score promoted hug tour across America.
We'll do it.
Yeah, Dave and I just giving hugs.
I would just want to go collect all the free drinks I'm owed. That's usually what I tell people after I've helped them out. I'm like, "You owe me a drink," and they're like, "Yes," and I'm like, "All right, I'm going to note where you live."
Yeah, as the guy who probably owes you the most, it's so unsatisfying to have to mail them.
You just, you covered about 15 or 20 of them in that bottle.
That was a good gift.
All right, let's go through this once again, remembering that we're always conservative.
Yeah.
So logic games, if you had the art installations, the kind of like floors in a department with gardening, etc., and the table game, this is where John and I are going to disagree. I'm going to say that makes no difference to your -7. John, your counterpoint.
Yes. I'm going to say with a particular combination of logical reasoning that I think that actually will loosen your scale by 1.
Here's where I think you're right, and here's why I think you're wrong. So I'm playing both sides of the hedge here.
Yeah.
Historically, the response to this section has been far worse than what we saw this weekend. From students I spoke to directly, even from the feedback from our instructors, it wasn't as if people felt the section was as rough as it has in the past. And so I think you're looking at this and you're like, "Oh yeah, we know that's a really hard section." And I don't know that they haven't changed something in it to make it easier. That's entirely possible here.
You're right. You're right about 2 things. It is entirely possible they've changed something, and I am undeniably biased on a historical view of this section. When it happened back in 2014, when it happened again in July of 2018, the response to this was just so calamitous that I didn't have a choice but to think, man, this is going to at least soften the scale.
Here's how I think we're going to resolve this. We're going to let you, the test taker, resolve it. If you felt that was a reasonable section, don't change your scaling. If you were like, that was one of the hardest sections I've ever done, I didn't know what was going on, I was completely confused, loosen your scale by 1.
Yeah.
Add 1 to it. Go from -7 to -8 for a 170.
I can live with that. And I don't want to suggest in any of this that the way that you and I interpret these tests and make our predictions is just crapshoot. It's not. This is actually fairly scientific. Like, you and I have got a pretty good gauge on this stuff. So when we do disagree, it's never going to be by more than 1 point, and it usually comes down to what you just said, which is sort of a user experience is going to tip the scale one way or another, but we're both pretty close to the middle.
Yeah, and I know exactly what you're going to do with the one LR section.
Right.
You're going to say that those two add up to a second one. And I don't really disagree with that, but let's continue on.
Okay.
So the other logic games was the one with the servers and the intermission and the senior junior. I think we both agree that has no impact on the scale. So if you were at -7, you'd stay at -7. Let's move to RC, where everybody will be happy to hear that both sections loosen your scaling by 1. So if you're sitting at -7, you've now moved to -8. If you happen to have been at -8 in your mind, you've now moved to -9.
That would be 9, but yeah. That would be my particular audience.
Yeah, this is why I have issues here.
Well, hang on. We're going to, again, there's a bit more context.
Okay. Now, remember, the first passage that we talked about was the French Revolution and women's rights, the Belize passage, the art-sport kind of comparison, and so on. That was a difficult section. The other section, which was about women's suffrage, and then kind of like the aesthetic judgments and testimony, copyrights, astronomy versus astrology, that was also difficult. So both of those add 1. Mm-hmm. We get down to the logical reasoning. And for me, at least, I would say that the 26 question one adds 1 to the scale, and the 25 question one does not. So unless we've mixed it up, which is always possible given how tired we were by the time the test ended on Sunday, that would mean that the teddy bear section adds 1 in terms of difficulty, whereas the one about the plants and the CO2 or the crabs, the school lunches, that does not add 1 to the scale. So for me, you can see that you're going to have everybody at -8 for the most part because of the way I see logic games. And then if you had this harder logical reasoning, you could move to -9. Mm-hmm. Now tell us about your theory on this, John.
Well, my theory is I'm probably putting a little less weight on the logical reasoning with the teddy bears and the exoskeleton, the toy companies, and a little more on the table game, the circular game. Mm-hmm. But I will say, if you had those two, I think that's the most comfortable -9 I could presume someone would get to.
Okay.
That I feel pretty good about as a -9. What I will say, and I think you'll agree with me, is I don't think there's any combination of sections here that could have gotten someone to a -10. None of this felt tough enough to get me there.
And that's an interesting thing, because if you say the table game's 1, you say both the reading comps are 1, and then you say the harder of the LR was 1, you technically have moved from 7 to 10. But what you're really saying is it's that combination of those two that would move you over.
I know you and I are always reluctant to do this in fractions, but I would say that tough games and that tough LR are probably both a 0.5.
And I just put it all on the LR and said it's just 1. So we both end up at -9 with that combination. I've just done it without,
you played a rounding game, and I'm trying to be more precise. Classic.
We've said before that we don't want to try to do that because that's the devil's lure right there.
It really
0.5, 0.3. We can't be that precise with the kind of generalized knowledge that we're looking at.
So, and again, I mean, to echo your point, you do have to use your own experience. If you're an amazing sort of games test taker here, and that game section crushed you, treat that with the insight that it deserves.
Yeah.
If it felt harder than anything you're used to, then it probably will shade the scaling. If you had an LR section, you're like, dude, I had that 26. It wasn't bad. Teddy bears, that was a cakewalk.
I heard that question's tough.
I did too.
It's weird too.
Yeah, that was the word I kept hearing. It's like, that was a strange one. But if you had that section and didn't feel bad about it, again, you have to take that into consideration.
Yeah. Ultimately, it means that a lot of the scales here are -8, the rest of them are -9. And I think probably for this test, knowing that the RC is tough, that's probably pretty fair overall. I would agree with you 100%. I can't see -10 for this. There's no outcome, no combination that to me would add up to -10 on this. By the same token, I don't see -6.
Yeah.
I think the RC and elements of the games and the logical reasoning are hard enough that we're not going to see a -6 on this, and unlikely, for me at least, -7. So there's some good and bad there. This is more in the middle, and I think a lot of people who took this test are going to think to themselves, that's probably not unreasonable.
Yeah, I think even if you had the easier game set and the 25 section LR, which we feel was a little bit easier, you're probably still at a -8. I don't see that as a -7.
Well, interestingly enough, that pretty much wraps it up in terms of the scaling. I know for you and I, John, it was for some reason, this, even though it was 2 days and it should have been a breeze for us, I know that we both felt pretty. I was destroyed by Sunday night. I was just utterly fatigued by this, and I didn't even take the test.
Yeah, you and I actually had it pretty easy, all things considered, and we're still pretty beat up.
Well, I think, we've got 2 more flex tests, and that's coming up in April and June, and we'll clearly do reviews for them. We'll see how that goes, because one of the things that's going to happen here in August is when they start mixing the experimental in, I'm questioning anybody's ability to really track all that information. I know we've been doing it for a long time and we're very comfortable, but I'm not sure 30 to 40 days a year of trying to do this when they are going to be intentionally trying to confuse people. Aesthetics in both passage sets. Come on, man. I know you did that on purpose to wreck my weekend.
Yeah.
And others. It's going to be a challenge. We'll see what happens after April and June. But as far as the February LSAT, that wraps it up. Your scores come out on March 10th, assuming you have the LSAT writing done. And hopefully everybody gets that and gets the score that they need and want and can hopefully use that to leverage themselves into some law schools and get some good money going forward.
Yeah, and now for a 3-day nap, which I think you and I are both well owed. Tequila-induced or not, I think you and I have earned it.
I will say that on Monday I didn't do a whole lot. I
It
checked some
feels like
emails.
somewhere in LSAC's headquarters there's a dartboard with both of our faces on it.
I was just very slow on Monday. People were asking me questions and getting the usual emails, and I was thinking to myself, nah, I worked all weekend on this. I'm not answering your question till tomorrow. So
Well, hopefully it's appreciated. This definitely took a toll, but I think we've got a pretty good grip on it at least.
yeah, I feel comfortable about this test. I have a feeling the next 2 flex tests we're going to feel really comfortable. But anybody taking this exam, start thinking about how much more difficult it would be for you as a test taker to determine what is real just by the addition of a single experimental section. In the old days, again, a couple years ago, you had a situation where everybody had the same 4 scored sections. So finding experimentals was a challenge, especially in logical reasoning, but you could do it if you spent enough time doing it, and you and I certainly did. And it allowed you to get to that point where you're like, okay, I know these are the 4 scored sections. You could definitively rule things out. Now imagine that there's not 8 different versions like there are today, but let's just say there's, 36 different versions. Imagine that for a moment and then throw in a bunch of experimentals, which creates, depending on how many experimentals they use, conceivably hundreds of different test forms. So there's a change coming, after June here that is going to be really confusing. It may come to a point where people after the test are like, I don't know what was real. I don't know what was scored. And that may become the new norm. Obviously, for some people hearing this, like, what? You and I spent a lot of time thinking about it and talking about it because it's not just that, it's an extra unscored section. It's the fact that we now are looking at hundreds of versions of the test and figuring out what's real and what's not is something that I am neither looking forward to nor think is possible.
Well, I think I speak for both of us when I say that I would rather be silent than wrong. So if there's a chance that you and I could ever broadcast one of these and actually provide the incorrect information, I would rather keep my mouth shut.
I'm going to quote you for that to your future wife so she can always come back to you on that one.
First of all, it's wives.
You haven't even got your first one underway.
Yeah.
You're slow. By the way, congratulations to your sister. She's just discovered she's gonna have her second baby.
Yeah, I'm an uncle times 2. I'm a double funkle.
It's amazing. I can't believe it.
Yeah, she's gonna have another little girl in August. And I'm so pumped because I don't have to buy her anything. They can just do hand-me-downs. It's perfect.
That's not how it works, John.
What? My sister, this is how you know that my sister and I are related. She got upset because her first baby was born in March, and her second baby's going to be born in August, and they're going to hit the same basically like ages at different times a year. So she's like, I don't have 6-month-old winter clothes.
Oh boy.
That's my sister. That's what she's upset about at the moment.
Well, that's just practical, man. I of course, was like, what?
Yeah.
Well, it seems like baby fever is in the air because another one of our friends, certainly an excellent friend of yours and a guy that I like quite a bit, he and his wife are going to have a child. So
it's going around. Yeah, I've never been happier for quarantine. My God. There's a fertility in the air that I can't stomach.
A fecund environment.
Fecund.
All right.
Fecund is the word.
I prefer to say it fecund. This is one of those words that you can agree to disagree on how to actually say it. We're going to. And on that note, if you get a chance, please subscribe to this podcast on iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, or anywhere else you may find it in the world. And if you've enjoyed it, please give us a rating or comment as well. And if you have any questions, please send those to lsatpodcast@powerscore.com. We do regular mailbag versions where we take student questions and talk about the situations, and I'm sure one of those is coming up relatively soon. On that note, stay safe, enjoy yourselves. We'll talk soon.